Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we have discontinued our in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we have instituted these. We now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is the fifth in a series on racism. Back in July, we had our first with Cynthia Kaufman and Bill Fletcher talking on police versus the people. Then Charles Mills and Linda Alcoff talked about racism and identity. Lewis Gordon, Fred Evans, and myself discussed combating racism. And Harry Targ and Valerie Chapman surveyed the history of class and white supremacy. Today, we will focus on abolishing whiteness and white supremacy, looking at both its structure and agencies. Our speakers are Carl Davidson and Melanie Bush. There are a lot of provocative questions to take up. What is whiteness? It is not just skin color, it's a socially given identity. But what is the content of that identity? Can one renounce that identity? As my t-shirt suggests, if you can read that, I used to be white American, but I gave it up in the interest of humanity. How does one do that? Can certain privileges come with white skin? What makes that racist? How can one be anti-racist? Can one avoid an essentialist binary othering? How to avoid racializing the other? How to abolish whiteness? Does that involve abolishing all group identities? And how can a group identity become progressive? What are the systemic roots of white supremacy? Can it function without racist intentions? Whiteness is also more than an identity. It is a power relation rooted in institutional policies and practices. Specifically, what are they? And how can systemic racism be overcome? Well, these are just some of the questions on my mind. Well, now let's hear what Melanie and Carl have to say. Melanie Bush, who will speak first, will explore the lived experience of whiteness and its relationship to the perpetuation of systemic white supremacy and racial capitalism. She is author, among other things, of Everyday Forms of Whiteness, Understanding Race in a Post-Racial World. Carl Davidson is a veteran activist, first known to my generation as president of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, back in the 1960s. Today, he is the national co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism and the national board member of Solidarity Economy Network. He has established the online University of the Left. Carl is a race abolitionist, some might say a race traitor. Well, after they've both had a chance to speak, we will then have a question and answer session. Invite you all to pose your questions and share your comments. But now let me pass the floor on to Melanie Bush. Welcome, Melanie. You go first.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you, Center for Global Justice. Thank you for those friends who are present today. I appreciate your being in this conversation. You posed so many important questions, Cliff. My comments really are directed in one like to respond to, I think, probably just a couple of them. And so whatever people want to be addressed in the question and answer, I'm happy to respond there. So I'm grateful to those who have guided me to the understandings I have now. These include familiar and community ancestors, activists, and scholars who have educated, challenged, and struggled with me, struggled with and loved me to this moment, and taught me everything I know about whiteness and white supremacy. Right now, I'm situated with People's Strike and May 1st Movement Technology, and those are very important learning spaces in my own activism. I'm a learner as a white woman who resides in community, academic, and movement spaces. I'm a learner as a human being who looks to the North Star of the many Black, Indigenous, and Brown people, past and present, whose clarity, wisdom, and leadership and example provide a path forward rooted in integrity, dignity, humanity, and respect. My intellectual and political grounding is in the critique and understanding of racial capitalism that situates white supremacy and Eurocentrism historically as a central organizing principle, political economy, culture, and ideology in the emergence, expansion, and existence of coloniality and the so-called modern world. In this way, I view white supremacy and its manifest form, whiteness, as intricately connected with configurations of heteronormative patriarchy, anti-Blackness, nationhood, and many other polarities, divides, and hierarchies that undergird all corners of contemporary society. The last 500 years have been a steady, unrelenting series of genocides and epistemicides that continue all over the globe, whether in vaccine or pandemic apartheid, state violence, US capitalism and imperialism, dispossession and extraction in the United States, Palestine, Colombia, India, Brazil, Mexico, and beyond. White supremacy is a core element of all of this. However, the last 500 years and today as well also provide powerful examples of resistance, resilience, and the affirmation of freedom and pluriversality as core values and visions. Focusing our gaze this way not only recognizes the centrality of white supremacy to capitalism and capitalism to white supremacy and coloniality, it allows us to know and see, build, and participate in a world that is defined by neither. We are at a juncture of radical social transformation. Whether sooner or whether later, we are at a point of choice, agency, and determination when ordinary people have the chance to reshape the world we live in. What does this mean? Why in this remarks do I focus on what perhaps most on this call already know and may likely agree upon? Unless we recognize and prioritize addressing the relationship of white supremacy to capitalism, we will view the racist atrocities of today's world either as aberrations or redeemable, as if reforms can change the foundation organizing principle of US and global society over the last 5 centuries. When we recognize this intrinsic connection, our thinking and actions shift our urgency to address not only the harm in the present, but also build the force, expand the we, engage our imaginaries, and call upon our freedom dreams to create the world we want and need. There are so many examples. We need to stop being surprised by white supremacy and stop clutching pearls. As Robin D.G. Kelly said when Zimmerman was acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin, the verdict was rendered not because the system failed, but because it worked. Picking off a bad apple by the name of Derek Chauvin, but not addressing the white supremacist infiltration of police forces, recognized even by the FBI, represents something similar. However, for 500 years, the system has been firmly immersed in an ideology, structure, and practice in which the protection of white property rights is sacrosanct. White people are always innocent and right. The very purpose of the police was to discipline, monitor, and contain Black, Indigenous, and Brown populations to protect their exploitation and elevate white positionality in the racial hierarchy. Kelly continues, if we do not come to terms with this history, we will continue to believe the system just needs to be tweaked, or that the fault line lies with a fanatical gun culture or a wacky right-wing fringe. Thinking about January 6th, or the more than 120 retired US generals and admirals who recently wrote Biden indicating we're in a fight for our survival as a constitutional republic like no other time since our founding in 1776. Or if we think about the way that critical race theory is now potentially banned in 20 states of the US, or that police murders have not let up, or that the US is still the greatest purveyor of violence globally, or we must recognize that it is the system, not some bad apples, some bad laws, some misinformed individuals who are to blame, that white supremacy and capitalism are at the core, and that is the system. By being surprised, we protect normative whiteness and the system. The very sheer veneer of liberalism and neoliberalism is just that. The system and structure remain intact, unforced, and the specter of fascism intensifies. However, while radical social change comes about because of pressure from social movements and ordinary people, we are at a moment where it is important to realize anyone can act on this racist ideology and stand for these racist structures. That said, it is like they are more likely to be supported by those who personally benefit, choice or not. And anyone can stand up against it. Temptations of privilege are seductive. However, for white people who choose this path, it requires for white people who choose this path, it requires a deep commitment to ongoing engagement and struggle, and placing oneself in relation to social movements led and informed by the most dispossessed. It is past time to recognize the systemic nature of the racist hierarchy and to do something drastic. For whites, this requires humility and a commitment to struggle. Young Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks are leading the way in abolitionist formations. Many young whites have begun to be drawn in, recognizing that their fates are not separate. And indeed, the future of all and everything is at stake. King said, these are revolutionary times. Years ago, all over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression. And out of the wounds of a frail world, new systems of justice are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the land are rising up as never before. Our only hope today, he said, lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. Indeed, as Baldwin said, to end the racial nightmare, we should not forget that the agency of these social groups whose critical consciousness has been instilled in them by their own histories and struggles, not as intellectuals and activists, but as people, is absolutely central to building a system that is democratic, egalitarian, and just. As white folks, we have the luxury and the privilege to ignore, deny, pretend, soften, moderate, believe that we're nice people who never do bad things, so these systemic patterns have nothing to do with us. We can be horrified but do nothing. We can reap the privileges of a system that continuously provides us with benefits of the doubt, second chances, and are allowed to believe it's all solely because of our individual efforts. I say we must unite with and support grassroots organizations fighting for deep structural change and get involved, be connected. At the very least, recognize that our future is intimately interconnected with theirs. And this is also that the structure of who owns what is vitally important, but so too, and this is from David Roediger, so too is the very idea of owning, enclosing, and consuming the land, of owning the labor and bodies of other. It's time for radical rethinking and for acting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Sounds like a manifesto there. Good way to start us off. Let me now pass the mic to Carl Davidson, who will give us his point of view. I'm going to put the spotlight on him so that you can see him as he speaks. Unmute your mic and take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Cliff. Thanks for inviting me. And also thanks to Melanie for all the very serious academic work that she's done. I first learned about race abolitionism and the invention of the white race from the guy who invented the concept, Ted Allen. And he and Noel Ignatieff had made an intervention into SDS when we were hotly debating this issue. And I spent a couple of years with him in a study group we had in Brooklyn in the early 1970s. And that's when he was working on his book. And early on, he made a comment that grabbed me. He said, from the 1619 or maybe for another 40 years or so, there were no white people in Jamestown. And I said, what do you mean? He says, there were Englishmen, there were Dutch, there were Spaniards, there were Africans of various sorts, there were Portuguese. He said, but there was no white people. The term hadn't come into being yet. And one thing I learned about Ted is that he didn't just read the literature that was available. He spent years going down to the Virginia to go through all the old records from the time of Jamestown on and going through them, trying to find the first time that white came up and the word was used. And it didn't come up until around 1670 or so. And it came up at Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon's Rebellion was interesting, and it turned out as a revolt of the masses against the elite who wouldn't give them enough arms to fight Indians. But later on, it became a generalized insurrection. What was interesting about it is that it was a united effort of English bondservants and Africans. The Africans had not yet been enslaved in any complete sense, the English at the time didn't quite know what to do with them because, the English bond servants came over. They had 5, 7, 12-year bonds. And so the Africans, they used the same laws to apply to the Africans, except that it was indefinite as, what their term of service was. And they had no way of thinking of it. It wasn't until 1705 where they finally passed the last of about 40 different laws in the colonial legislature that made the child of every African woman also a slave in perpetuity. So that's what made the white race. It was a series of about 40 different laws. The interesting thing about the first one was against intermarriage, which should tell you something right there. It was the colonial elite declaring a monopoly of women. And then the second one was that a white servant was allowed to carry a weapon of his master, but an African servant wasn't allowed to carry a weapon. And then there were a bunch of others in between. But so this concept to me was absolutely fascinating. And the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Because, when you think about it, you look at the color of your skin. And I always tell people, look what color, look at your skin, what color. I says, it's not white. I says, it's a kind of pinkish brown, But the pink supremacy doesn't have quite the right ring to it, does it? And so that's your clue. That's your first clue. What it means is that white skin is a political concept. It has nothing to do really with biology. The variation in skin color is no more significant, biologically speaking, than what size shoe we wear. But it had been politicized, and it had been politicized by the master class in order to create a common front with European bond servants with them against bond servants of color from Africa. And so this is a mention of the color line. And it was designed to keep both of them down. The whites given certain advantages, the so-called white skin privilege. Ted was the guy who invented that term. And he borrowed it from somewhat from W.B. Du Bois, but in a specific form, he invented it. And it was designed to hold the whites down as well as the blacks. So the white skin privilege is never in the interest of any worker of any color. That doesn't mean it's not real. The advantages aren't real, but it's not in the class interest of any worker. So that was Ted's approach, and it's what I learned. When you step back and really think about it, here you have this hierarchy: white, yellow, red, brown, black. It's kind of racial. And you think about it, where the hell does this come from? It's a kind of a hierarchy that only somebody on the top could come up with to try to describe us. And you find it out early on, especially if you do genealogy and you look back at the old census records, the census records from 1790 on. The first thing they do is you have to be a free white male householder to get your name down there. And that meant that there was unfree whites, that were whites who were still under bondage. And then the women and the children, and male and female, they got little check marks. They didn't get their names on their little check marks. Then you had another column, was how many slaves you had, if any. And then there was another column for how many Indians you might be a part of your household. So right from the beginning there, you had these check boxes. And we've had these check boxes ever since. You get them when you get your census form. Are you white? Are you black? Now they've changed them a little. You can be Hispanic or something, a few Asian or things like this. But when you think about it, and they're tied to color, is what they're tied to colors. And they don't, none of them make any real sense. African, for instance, it's the name of a continent. The people who came over here were all different tribes and spoke different languages. They became a common people here. And we call them African Americans. African Americans as a people were forged here. And then, so these things, these racial hierarchy categories are clearly have a political purpose and is designed primarily to keep one of them, the first of them, the white category, on top. So, the people on the bottom, of course, didn't care for this. And, wherever there's this kind of racialized oppression and racialized capitalism, capitalism has been racialized from day one. It's always been racialized. And so when the slaves began to rise up in rebellion and the abolitionist movement in solidarity with them began to spread, we had, the Civil War. And the Civil War and the Civil War amendments, made slavery illegal, largely so anyway. But what it didn't do was get rid of the white race. The white race as a concept. The white race was the concept that allowed for racism and the divisions to reproduce itself. So getting rid of slavery was only a halfway mark. Of course, they didn't understand Gramsci back then because Gramsci hadn't been born yet. But what the white race did was create the kind of hegemony and persuasion to keep a large part of the population with a kind of white solidarity, along with the upper crust, and to turn them against the other. If you want to do something interesting sometime, take a look up the 13th Amendment and look up the first draft of it. The first draft of it is quite different from the one that was passed. The one that was passed had a huge loophole in it that says you could still have slavery if it was punishment for a crime. So soon after the Reconstruction governments were defeated, one of the Southerners, upper crust, made it a crime. They created the crime of vagrancy. Well, what was vagrancy? Vagrancy was mean that you were black and that you weren't doing anything. You didn't have to do something to be a vagrant. You didn't have anything. If you were, going around looking for a job or going to visit your relatives or something, and you could be seized and imprisoned, and then you would be sold from the sheriff's jail. You would be sold off to different mining companies or railroad companies or whatever to work off your fines. And you never really got to work off your fines because you ended up with more fines or more infractions. So it was a matter of bringing slavery back with another name, and they used the white color line to create these things. So the social order. Our social order, the question of identity is interesting here, because we all have identities, and we have any number of them at any time. I'm a believer in Gramsci's concept of conflicted consciousness. We don't just have one thing in our consciousness. It wasn't only Gramsci. Hegel talked this way too, and some other philosophers. But we have a conflicted consciousness. And part of it, our consciousness is really a hologram of interests, values, family beliefs, and identities. One of which is a kind of white identity. Now, society designates us as white, but we don't have to accept it. So when people ask me if I'm white, I tell them no. I say society designates me as white, but I do my best to refuse all the so-called advantages that I'm supposed to get because of it, And it's tough, because they're all over the place. They're everywhere. But I think the interesting point is that you don't simply abolish an identity. You manage to try to find a way to substitute a new identity for an old one. So what I suggest to people is look into your own ancestry. You know, I says I don't identify as white anymore. I identify as a Scots-Irish American. Call me a hillbilly revolutionary intellectual on top of it. I said all of those are social constructs too, but they have much more of an anchor in history and reality than the tone of my skin does. The tone of my skin doesn't really have any real content to it that's of any kind of real significance. So I would much rather identify as a Scots-Irish American hillbilly revolutionary intellectual than as a white person. So that's what I do. And that's what I encourage other people to do, to look up and, look up to their own ancestry and their, where they've come from and so on, and look at it that way. It's a kind of reversal of what the country tries to do to us. They try to take all kinds of people and turn them into whites. Noah Ignatieff, as most of you probably know, wrote, his big claim to fame after he left the factories and went to Harvard is he wrote his master's thesis, and then became a very popular book, How the Irish Became White. And it was an interesting book, and it told a lot of truths. And later on, there was all this, racism became scientific around the time of the turn of the century, and they really tried to fine tune all this stuff. And it's amazing the number of different degrees of, on this color scale. First of all, wasn't when they ended up making it about, 20 different categories and gradations, and even the white race, the Confederates of the Lost Cause started making distinctions for Anglo-Saxon superiority as opposed to other English. They were looked down upon. You had to have Anglo-Saxon genes to be they made gradations among whites. So all of this was a lot of nonsense. And it was all purely political. It had nothing to do with science. It had nothing to do with what was real. It had nothing to do with biology. It was all about the exercise of political power and to divide the population into a kind of hegemonic consensus, a kind of consent to be part of a white united front, or if you weren't in it, to try to find a way to get into it, and then to use that to direct against all the so-called others, the ones that were kept out of it. And that's the secret of their rule. It has been from day one. It's been the secret of the bourgeoisie's rule in this country from day one. And it's why they're so furious. Why, the denial of tenure to this African-American professor down in North Carolina. All you got 20 states all up in arms passing laws against critical race theory. Why? The reason why is that we're finally getting to the quick that this whole thing is a fiction. And once we expand it, it will be mind-blowing. I was talking a little bit earlier, and I'll wrap up with this story. Some workers here a few years back asked me to do a study group for them on the Constitution. They had been arguing at work whether health care was constitutional or not. I said, okay, I'll do it. I said, get about 20 people together, but I'll give you a little more than what you're expecting. So we had 8 classes, and the first one I started with the Iroquois. I said, that's from around here. The Iroquois were first ones here. And they had a constitution called the Law of Great Peace that had 113 articles. And so I studied that. And then I went through all the different constitutions, different states. And in the course of this, I exposed the theory of the white race when we got to the Civil War amendments and so on. Anyway, at the end of the course, this one worker, this postal worker, he comes, a white guy, or designated white guy, he came up to me, he said, So he says, this whole fact that this white race is just this is just something people made up. And I said, yeah, they sure did, and they did a thorough job of it, and we can see the purpose of it. And he says he had agreed, he followed the argument, and he went over it and he agreed with it, and he said, it's the most liberating thing I've ever learned in my life. So to me, that was a sign that it might take a long time and it might take a lot of work, but if we really want to get rid of white supremacy, we need to fight all the embedded structures of it, in social order and housing and jobs and police and everything else. But we also have to, at bottom, we have to get rid of the idea that there's such a thing as a white race and we're in it. Because as long as that's held to by a large number of people, the master class still has its hooks in us. So that's why I call myself a race abolitionist.
All right. Well, thank you, Carl. Some provocative ideas there also. And want to open the floor for questions and answers, comments. Let me just say a word about how we're going to handle this, because there are some people watching this on YouTube and they don't have any way of getting their questions to us directly. But what YouTube viewers can do is email your question or comment to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. I'll monitor that and pass your question on to our speakers. For those in the Zoom room, well, it's easier. You can put your questions directly to Carl and Melanie, your comments, and we can engage in some dialogue. So I will put you all on a gallery view so I can see everyone here. And if you turn on your cameras so we can see you, if you have a question, just wave at me and I'll call on you. So who would like, everybody, please turn on your cameras. Nice to know who it is we're talking with. Good, thank you. So who has the first question or comment?
Go ahead, Lauren.
Lauren? Okay, Lauren Langman.
Well, if nobody else has anything to say, I've never been at a loss of words. Given, I've known Carl for what, is 100 years now, something like that?
Something like that.
It's really nice, especially both Carl and Mel and I being friends of mine. I don't have anything to really say in distinction, but I do have a few things that I can say. Number one, Carl, I don't know if you know my book, God, Guns, Gold, and Glory. But one of the points I make there is the discussion of Bacon's Rebellion, something that I didn't learn in my history course when I was in high school, of course, and how what you talked about with the Virginia Slave Act, how whiteness was created, and the whole point here is how these kinds of notions of racial superiority or cultural superiority or religious superiority do become insinuated within human character. And this is why, as you know, for me, the incomplete part of Gramsci, because Mussolini was such a jerk, he couldn't give many Freud to read, that it's just not simply a matter of a rational choice, but it's deeply held and emotionally. And so you find, some of the most ugliest crap in the world along racist lines. And it's not just in the United States where we see this. We see this in so many other places as well. And one of the questions we always have is, well, what can we do about it? Well, those of us that stand in front of students can be a little bit of help and things like that. But I think that what's really important to note, and this is not something that either of you discussed, but I think it's an interesting footnote. all of us, and I'll just speak for myself and you because we're a little bit over 40. One of the things that we have noticed, especially with the young kids today, is for various reasons, and maybe I'll talk about this sometime, Cliff. The young people are getting away from this crap. They are really getting away from this crap. And rather than go on for hours and hours, which I can easily do, as everybody knows, let me just make one interesting point on the protests against the systematic videoed murder of George Floyd. On June 6th of last year, 25 million Americans came out at one day to protest, demonstrate, occupy, and whatever. As a guy, and for the people who don't know me, I'm a sociologist. For a guy who does social movements, very rarely do we ever have a situation where more than 1 or 2% of a population actually participate in the movements. This was close to 10% of the adult population. Now, the interesting thing there, and it's one of the things that is so very clear in Chicago, maybe not elsewhere. The majority of the people in the marching, first of all, they were younger than my daughter, but the majority were white people, young white people. And so in a number of ways, the young white people, as well as other minorities, other groups that are minorities, are getting very, very much past the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, etc. And although not directly tied to the racist comments that you were making about racism, one of the things that I found important, because for a number of years I was very active in Middle East peace, the extent to which I'm noticing a tectonic shift in the plates of American character, from blind support of the, I don't know if I want to call the Israelis Nazi. I can call them Israeli Nazis, at least the Zionist side of it, that Americans, especially young Jews, are moving away from that kind of thing. And so I don't have anything specifically to add what you guys said, because it was great. And I really agreed with almost absolutely everything that was said. But I do see, and this wasn't part of your discussion, but part of the hope is that the young kids are really moving in the right direction. And I think the good news is 50-some% of them support socialism. The bad news is that only 1% of those know what socialism is. But I do very much think that someday that we are headed toward a socialist society. That's the good news. The bad news is that most of the people watching this aren't going to live to see it.
I'll make one addition to your comment on yours. I agree with you that there's this huge sea change, but it's interesting to me. I'm in an area where it's a Trump majority, and it's a white proletarian county for the most part. And what I found is that the explanations, the belief system that the whites Trump or the pro-Trump people hold is kind of interesting. From their point of view, racism is over, with one exception. All of them are, longtime lovers of Dr. King, and that the only racism left in the country is black racism against whites, and that the way you inflict racism is to talk about it. If you bring it up, you're playing the race card, and that makes you a racist. So that's a new form that white identity politics takes place, and it's going to be an interesting one to crack, and that's one of the reasons why they're so furious about critical race theory.
Well, I could comment, but I don't want to. I will let other people talk. But absolutely. Well, I will say one quick comment. One of the things that folks like us that have been around for a while, when you confront people on their values and their identities, which are so much the same thing, rather than open up, people will double down. People will basically clam up. And so it's one of the points that I've often made, that if you really want to have a successful argument with somebody or someone or something, you might be better off arguing with a shoe or a doorknob, because when you confront the Trumpers with the absurdity of their systems and the contradiction. So, for example, although this wasn't directly what you were saying, it speaks to it, that, the Republicans are now calling themselves a working class party. okay, they can call themselves whatever they want. But every piece of legislation that has ever passed through anywhere near them that has helped the actual workers of this country, which depending on how you want to measure it, is anywhere from 50 to 90% of them. Everything, whether it's minimum wage, the expansion of Medicare, they've done everything they can to screw workers over, black or white. I'm going to stop here because I talk too much to let other people talk.
So
Can
I'm
I,
going to jump.
can I
Go
add
ahead,
a,
Cliff.
can I add a comment here? And then we'll open it up to others. You mentioned the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. In addition to the large numbers of whites and white youth in particular who came out for Black Lives Matter protests, I thought the verdict in that trial was also quite telling. It was now, of course, the fact that the police establishment testified against him went a long ways toward the conviction, and also the fact that the video was so decisively, indicting of Chauvin. But I thought that it was interesting that the prosecution succeeded in painting George Floyd as a human being, not just as a Black man, but his humanity was highlighted. And that made it possible for the jurors to see him in human terms rather than in racialized terms. Let's see.
I'm gonna jump to one thing,
Yes, Mel.
which is to incorporate a couple of comments, because I think part of my point is actually that some of what's being said, I think, is problematic and dangerous. And I think that as for any of us in this space, and I think it's the overwhelming majority who are classified by society as white, to position ourselves, while whiteness is a myth or fiction, to position ourselves now in relation to that, with that being a defining point, I think is problematic, because whether we like it or not, our lives are defined by our whiteness. And I think that until the time that we see any move for white supremacy to be reduced as an organizing principle, that part of my point is that I think we have a particular responsibility to be thoughtful and mindful. For example, yes, it's true. I think, that there were many white young folks who were out, but it's also then the question of why is that, and what is being built in relation to the system that I think we need to also say, yes, but where is the recognition of the racism as part of the entire structure? And unless we make that connection again and again and again, I think we end up misreading and misunderstanding, for example, what's happening in those spaces. And I think, in one of the parts of, look, I think it's like shifting from the intention to if we recognize this as the system and the structure, what's incumbent upon us who are designated as white in this moment to bring force to challenging that system. And I think it's by recognizing the power that we bring, but in relationality. In one of the interviews that I did around the Breaking the Code of Good Intentions, Everyday Forms of Whiteness, one young person said, oh, well, you know, what we really need to do, young white, I think it was female, said, you know, if we get rid of all the old white people, that's where the racism exists. Then white supremacy will be eliminated. But in nudging a little bit more, it's almost a liberalism that says, well, if we can interact nicely, if we can come show up in these certain spaces, that what is deeply rooted will change. And I think that's exactly my provocation to all of us, to say, if we recognize it's deeply rooted, what's incumbent upon us, not just to say, oh, that's terrible, or to you know, to note things, but to see ourselves in relationship to the world, really the world's people who are rising.
Okay, I saw Gregory Diamond's hand. Let me call on you next.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. And thank you to our speakers, because there are a lot of interesting points made. And just as a side note, I'm glad that Carl mentioned Ted Allen's book, because it was something I read many years ago and influenced my thinking in many ways. But what I want to make one point is that we're talking about this sometimes in a way that seems like an intellectual project. And this has been something about how the left in the United States and other places has acted for a long time. The word that I think needs to be brought up here is solidarity, and solidarity and struggle if we are going to transcend some of these problems. Recognition, which is very important, which Melanie just mentioned, but I think one of the most potent ways that recognition comes is when you're struggling for something, you're struggling against injustice, and maybe struggling regarding climate change to be against a building of a place, another oil refinery, let's say, or a chemical refinery in Louisiana, which affects everybody regardless of their skin color, et cetera. So I think that we need to talk a lot about solidarity and struggle. I think that's really important, because that is really how a lot of deep learning comes about. And we begin to recognize, all of us, our common humanity, who we are in our struggle for justice, whatever way that takes. Going out for protests is great, and Lord knows, you know, over the past 50 plus years, or 60 years, I should say, that I've been doing that. That's great. But what really builds things is when you're working on particular projects and working with people with a particular goal in mind that obviously is based on social justice. So for me, I think that's the important point I wanted to make, was about solidarity and struggle as the way we transcend some of the racist things that are going on and really learn about who we are.
Anyone wants to pick up on those points? Or let's see. Jerry
Sure.
Fastrup, are you raising your hand? Okay,
think
and after that, then Fred.
I don't think I'm going to be quite as articulate as the rest of you. It's all been very good. But the problem for me is what Carl said. Living in a red county, I guess, in a proletarian county, as that, and those people do not see that there is a problem with race. And if there is a problem, as you said, it's the minorities ganging up on me, not me ganging up on the minorities. And when you pose it that way, I have a hard time conjuring up how the hell you solve that problem. And Greg, I think, came at it with, the idea of solidarity. My thought has always been that the Democratic Party really abandoned the working class, and Ronald Reagan stole them away with his shining city on the hill and the welfare queen and all of those kinds of sirens and stuff. And politically, I don't see how we get it back unless it's through the idea of solidarity. But it means that the liberals have to more tolerance to engage and push solidarity at the same time, not being totally put off by the racism that continues to exist in America. And for me, the political solutions to this is really, it really comes down to race. And I'm just at a loss to practically come up with a political program that's really going to attack this, because none of our politicians, none of them, well, I won't say none of them because there are some good politicians out there, but the good ones are such a minority. I guess I'm just pessimistic, and maybe somebody can help me out with being a little bit more positive about it. My main thing is I'm not going to live to see it, but when my kids and my grandkids become the dominant demographic group, things will be better. Because white people got to remember they're only 6% of the world's population, and the world is integrating in ways that were never dreamt of when I was a kid even. And that's the hope I have. But, for me personally, it still seems like a long way away. So my 2 cents on it. But you guys hit on a lot of really good stuff. I could listen to all of you talk for another 2 or 3 hours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. If either of our speakers want to comment on any points as we go along, feel free to jump in. If not, Fred Evans was the next hand I saw, and after that, Jerry Harris.
Thanks, Cliff. First of all, I want to thank Melanie and Carl for the way they've informed me about aspects of race that I tend to overlook, and brings it back into view. And then I wanted to go and make a comment that would link up with Melanie's point about protests and Gregory's reply to that, and back over to solidarity. And the way I sort of see it, I guess, is that with the protests, one thing they're very useful for is building up a kind of ethos, attitude, you might say, that's anti-racist. But at the same time, we need the policy change part of anti-racism too. So if we put the two together, developing the ethos and then working the policy changes, that I think gives a strong basis to the idea of solidarity that we're after. I would just add 2 other points to that, or questions to it, that the policies we're talking about, for instance, you can think of the idea of making a lot of changes in the way that policing is done in the US, but also the most important, I think, outside of the issue of race directly, is the socioeconomic. If we talk about the white working class, in 2016 election, I think it was something like 60% of the white working class voted for Trump. They made up 30% of the total people working for Trump. And so I still think the best strategy, although it has some problems too, is the socioeconomic one, where we want socioeconomic equality as well as racial equality. And if we can keep those two, and that if we go back to race, of course, you have the same issues within races that you have in the total society, that some are better off and others worse off. So until we can get a more equal distribution of wealth, we would lack that solidarity that we need also to keep the left in power, which would be both with the racial diversity as well as the as a class issue. And then finally, in ways of talking about this idea of solidarity, I like to use the idea of voices. The individuals have voices, but so do groups. Voice is a pretty flexible term. And then think of the idea of equal audibility. And to have that equal audibility, you also have to have the equal socioeconomic differential I was talking about. So I just wanted to kind of get that, I guess, out as a way of seeing how a number of these could come together. And the last part also meant to refer to Jerry and how he was saying it looks pretty hopeless in some ways. And because that socioeconomic issue is such a tight one, it's not hopeless, but it's certainly more difficult because of it.
Okay,
What-
Jerry
what are the-
Harris is next.
So, yeah, it's okay.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
one quick thing, and another thought that came to my head in terms of solidarity. Instead, or in addition to talking about, the race stuff, I think a lot more political effort could be put into really harping away at equal justice, that Lady Justice is blind. And we have to constantly make the point that she may be blind, but our institutions are not behaving like that. And we need to live up to those ideals better than we do. So that was just another thought that popped into my head as you were talking, Fred.
Okay, we've got two Jerrys here. Let's go to the other Jerry Harris now.
I think trying to organize or convince a lot of Trump supporters to be anti-racist is essentially a waste of time. If you went to high school with some of them or they're your neighbors, sure, talk to them. But there's 60 or 70 million people who don't vote. They're mostly poor white, Black, and Latinx. And so if you want to spend some effort organizing people, go out and organize those people, because we'll be able to organize them a hell of a lot easier than convincing people who believe in QAnon theories and white supremacy to win them over. So I think we have two tasks, and it's sort of what both Fred and Melanie spoke to. One is participating in the day-to-day struggles. That's solidarity idea, I think, rolling up your sleeves and getting down there and working for reforms. But I thought Melanie was speaking to something a little deeper that Marxists and socialists need to do also, which is to bring radical theory into reformist movements and to talk about racialized capitalism. Because defunding the police is not really that radical. It's basically saying the city should reorder its spending priorities. If you speak about it like that, it's not very radical, but it sounds really radical and upsets a lot of people. Defund the police. So does the language of abolitionism, which of course you're not going to abolish jails and the police until you have a post-capitalist society. And even then it's going to be quite a bit of time. So the civil rights movement was reformist. The Black Lives Matter movement is reformist. But we know that revolutionaries emerge out of these movements through both the struggle and meeting people who can introduce revolutionary ideas. So I think there's two tasks there. And if you just stand on the sidelines and give them theory, it's like, fuck you. I don't, why listen to you? You're not doing anything. You're standing in the doorway lecturing me. So that is isolating. But if all you do is work in solidarity and you don't introduce more radical and more deep going ideas, then I don't think we're doing our job as Marxists and revolutionaries and socialists.
I'll make a brief comment here if I can, which is that this is a Trump county, and it's largely 90% proletarian, but it's also 40% of the white workers oppose Trump. it's not, sometimes people forget about them, you know. I'm out walking my dogs, and one of my neighbors, a white guy, who he looks like, one of the guys riding around on the pickup trucks attacking the Capitol. But he comes up and stops his car and he says to me, "How are we going to get that Ku Kluxer out of the White House?" You know, so so that was his opening. We got a good conversation about it. He talked about his time in the mills, and he came to hate the Klan early on. His father taught him it because the Klan was anti-Catholic, and so that's where some of it came from. But I think the question of solidarity is critical. Most of the people in this area, because of its radical labor history, their sense of working class solidarity are buried. They're not gone. They're just buried and overwhelmed by a lot of common sense. And so what I try to do is I try to unearth it. I try to bring it back to the surface and remind them of our traditions of working class solidarity, or what made everything valuable that we have, made it possible. Fred Hampton was the one who said it first. We fight racism with solidarity. He summed it up very briefly. And so I agree that's a critical point. But on the other hand, the white skin privilege is all over the place. Some people say they didn't think there was such a thing. I said, get in my car with you. I'll drive you around in 30 minutes and show you 100 examples of it. So it's real. And it has to, it can be attacked in many ways. It exists in housing, it exists in the schools. The schools out in the white townships are much better than the one here in downtown Eloquent, but they get different amounts of funding. And it's because ours is largely African American. So anyway, there's all of these things have to be fought. Fighting for solidarity is the key weapon against white supremacy and white chauvinism. And there's a buried culture of solidarity within the entire working class that needs to be brought to the surface.
I'd like to say something about this matter of white skin privilege, because
What did Judy ask you about trying?
Lauren, can you mute? White skin privilege, oftentimes things are mistaken for that, which in fact come from other sources. For example, here in Mexico, expats who live here are in many ways privileged. And sometimes they say, oh, well, we're benefiting from white skin privilege. But I point out that even a Black person from the US living here with the same retirement benefits would be enjoying the same privileges. Really, it's a national privilege that they are experiencing in this context. Now, of course, that national privilege has a history that has a racial dimension to it, but it's not so simple that you can say, well, just because you have certain benefits, that's a sign of white skin privilege. You have to go dig much more deeply. Carl alluded to the way in which housing practices and education, et cetera, in the U.S. Contributes to racial disparities. But it's not easy for most people to see how there is a racial element in those institutions. If you point out that, well, the reason you live in such a nice suburb with a nice house and lawn and very, very neat and orderly environment, the reason you can enjoy that is because of redlining or because of zoning. But it takes quite a bit of sociological sophistication for people to understand that comes about as a result of zoning laws and and real estate agents' practices and bank lending practices, etc. And to identify it as white skin privilege is something that goes beyond people's lived experience. Their experience is, well, I have a nice neighborhood to live in because I worked hard and I deserve it. I merit it. And people who live in poor, congested housing in the inner cities and who are Black, well, obviously, they don't merit the benefits that I have. Anyone want to comment on this question of white skin privilege?
And then after I can
Yeah.
come back.
Okay, Lauren, and then Lenny.
Just very, very, very quickly, I think you hit an important nail on the head. That part and parcel of American character that I was talking about was Carl. And one of the greatest commentators on American society was Alexis de Tocqueville, who was the first person to write about individualism. And the reason that I am in my privileged position and you are in yours is not because of whiteness or anything like that. It's because we worked hard and it's all individual, and those other people. And going back to something, I think it was, I don't remember, it was something, one of the people made that was alluded to is we cannot, it would really be great if we could just all gather around in a circle, a multiracial circle, and sing Kumbaya and love each other and hug each other. Well, now that we don't have to social distance, we can hug each other. But the deal here, and the word has to be mentioned, structure. The structure of real estate, the structure of occupation, the structure that Carl was alluding to about our educational system in this country is based on real estate taxes, unlike most European places, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to add one final thing, and I will shut up, I promise, for the rest of the day. One of the points that Carl and I agree on in a large part, we have some disagreements here, but is the importance of Gramsci in pointing out so much of this stuff. And I would say that right now we're in a major war of position. And that is the ideology, the attack on the ideology that makes the structural transformation possible. And I think that this is part and parcel of what's going on. But I think we also have to remember, and this is the note of optimism. I'm always optimistic. I mean, Taro, if you're a Marxist, you're already outside the loop. But is that what Gramsci pointed out is his notion of the interregnum. And for the people that don't know that, that's the period between the dying of the old and the emergence of the new. And one of the points that Gramsci made is that at that time you see these morbid symptoms, and if we just look about us every day in the newspapers, there's another shooting, there's another racial incident. My daughter lives in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. They're seeing a tremendous upsurge in anti-Semitism there, of burning of synagogues and things like that. If we look at what just happened in Israel, the attack on the Palestinians, that these are the morbid symptoms. And, hopefully, I know that some of us are getting up in years. We may not see it soon. We may not see it at all. But I do think that, to be optimistic, better things are happening. One final comment. As a guy who does social movement research, one of the things that happens to people when they participate, not necessarily as Carl and I have done for years, and many of the other people, being at the core, but if you just go to marches, this changes consciousness a little bit and opens up a space for critical thought. So even if you're just out there marching and yelling, fuck you to the police and all of that kind of stuff, that may not necessarily turn you into a 24/7 radical, but it opens up that space for critical thought. And someone like some of us, that have taught like sociology or philosophy, and I don't want to disregard anything else, history, these are critical sciences or critical ways of thinking, of not taking for granted what we see. This is a tradition that goes back to Plato. And if we can just open minds a little tiny bit, that's the first step that's necessary. I could go on, but I won't.
Okay, Melanie.
So I'm okay, and I'm actually kind of accustomed to being perhaps representing a slightly provocative space. I'm okay with that. I feel like that's the most love we can give to each other. And I guess what I want to say is, if you recall, one of the very first things that I said was, about the link of white supremacy to capitalism and coloniality and all the different forms, and I included around nationhood, because the role that the United States has played globally, we, on this call, I imagine we all recognize. But in terms of widespread privilege, I will say, I think, yes, we have to be sophisticated in what we think, and both and every which kind of way. But I also think if you ask, any Black person traveling, and they're having the privilege of travel and being from the United States, their experience is quite different than being a white person traveling anywhere in the globe. And that I think we have to be sophisticated, and particularly for those of us who are white, when we juxtapose that sophistication and prioritize the other part of that equation, which may be very well true in terms of the US positionality and what that means, it undermines the reality of our own where we reside, and our own, whether we're talking or whether we're acting. I feel like we have a particular responsibility, and that's my point, is that unless we recognize the power, the power structure, it's like, it's like King said, a letter from Birmingham jail about, we're talking over here about, folks who supported Trump, but we're not talking about the rest of everybody who may, and how we are implicated. I work on a campus at a university, which is right within the third most segregated part of the nation. And I attended in the past year, they're doing all these, anti-bias, anti-implicit bias trainings. And everyone was, talking about, well, how could those people, like, there was a real live examples of things happened at the university. And everyone's like, oh, like, wow, if someone did that, how could they do that? And I'm like, yo, this is us. It's not them. And as long as we maintain, it's like there's some bad people. It's like, the young folks on the street, they ACAB, all cops are bad. It's like, at what point do we reckon with the fact that the system, like, yes, policies matter, yes, politicians matter, but at the same time, if we're not also talking about a law, I mean, look at law, the ebb and flow of history happens. And as long as we're talking within the system, we're not putting our emphasis on building what building and standing, really, like King said, with the barefoot people of the world. It's like Du Bois, like the dark world is rising. And I guess I would pose to all of us, because it's a very uncomfortable in some ways reckoning as a white person, that to come to terms with this kind of thing. But it's like what Du Bois says, what does it feel like? How does it feel to be a problem? And I would pose that as long as we as white folks look for the exceptions or the ways to sort of contextualize, as opposed to see how central white supremacy is to everything. It's like, it's no surprise. January 6th was no surprise. I was talking to folks in Mexico. That's where the pearl is. Like, why is everyone clutching their pearls? Why is any of this a surprise? And to the extent that kind of white, sort of like it should be a happy ending, or there's a good way to spin this, like, that's normative whiteness. And I think it's painful. I think we can do that work. I think it means an everyday commitment to, like, okay, like, where am I positioned? What do I need to learn? And, I have, huge respect for Center for Global Justice, for folks who I know on this call. but I think that we need a deeper reckoning, and I forget who said that, maybe it was Jerry, of a deepening reckoning of our own relationship to the everyday entrenchment of whiteness and white supremacy in our own lives. And it's not like we're the good people because we're over here talking about abolishing white supremacy or whiteness. It's an everyday thing, but that's also why I think that being in relationality to communities and to people in struggle, and recognizing the leadership of those who know from their everyday experience, that's where we can position ourselves really in a liberatory space, because ultimately I think we can, and I think our way out is by locating ourselves in relationship, but with tremendous humility.
Melanie referred to the racial sensitivity training sessions that have become fairly common in many institutions. And of course, that brings to mind this book, White Fragility, by Robin Alexander, and Robin DiAngelo, rather. And I came across an interesting example in this of the misuse of the whole notion of white skin privilege. She, in one place, gives this list of some of the resources available to white people: self-worth, visibility, positive expectations, psychological freedom from the tether of race, freedom of movement, a sense of belonging, and a sense of entitlement to all of the above. Now, and she says that the problem is that that racism elevates white people. Well, I'm not sure that she's got it quite right there. It's not that racism elevates white people, it's that it denigrates Black people. The list of things that she gave there as things that are taken for granted by white people are what everyone should be entitled to. The problem is not that you have a sense of self-worth and recognition by others. The problem is that it is denied to people of color. You don't have to give up those benefits. You have to simply extend them and make them universal. I mean, for example, if a white motorist gets pulled over by the police on a traffic stop, he expects to be treated with some degree of respect and so on. He doesn't feel that he's at risk of being shot by the police. Well, if that's a white skin privilege, how do you give up that white skin privilege? Not by saying, well, you have to treat me the same way you treat Black motorists. No, you address the white skin privilege by changing police practices so that all motorists are treated with the same respect. Any other comments or questions? I've been
See,
looking
Cliff,
at
that's precisely my point, is that if we only see white supremacy and racism as something that discriminates negatively, we also don't recognize that it's a power relationship and it discriminates positively. In other words, it elevates. And I could blab on for hours now. I'm on the university, like a review committee, and I can tell you, like, point by point by point how it happens. You have two cases and there it goes. And probably all of us can. And I think that's the point I'm trying to make, that it's a power relation.
Yeah,
And that
it elevates people of white skin, but often those benefits are benefits that ought to be available to all. That's my point. It's when they're denied to some that we have racism coming into play.
A friend of mine, Richie Rothstein, has come out with a new book, The Color of Law. I highly recommend it. Take the question of, he focuses considerably on the question of segregation. And he makes a very good point. He says there's no such thing as de facto segregation. All the stuff in the North that has been labeled de facto segregation really has the hand of the government behind it. And I use it as an example. Here. I'm in the town of Aliquippa, which is mostly black, about half and half black and white. At the townships that surround it on the hills, and Center Township, Hopewell Township, Independence, Raccoon. After the war, these are where the huge new housing developments were built. And one of them was even built on the top of an area called Davidson Heights, which was named after my ancestors. And so they had a Facebook page, and they asked me to give them a history of Davidson Heights, how it came to have my name on it and so on. So I did. And I says, the interesting thing you need to ask yourself is, why is Davidson Heights all white? And none of them knew. They said, well, maybe the blacks couldn't afford it or so on and so forth. I said, no. These houses were built for guys coming home from World War II on the GI Bill. And they all got their mortgages here approved through the GI Bill. That's how your parents and so on got they got through the GI Bill. But the provisions in the GI Bill were that these mortgages were not to be given to African American GIs because they would cause tension in the neighborhood. So the federal government instructed the banks not to give mortgages to black steelworkers who could afford them easily, and then kept them out. And it was amazing. None of the people allowed in this discussion, they'd never heard of this. They had no idea that these kind of government policies were implemented and racial covenants were built into the deeds. They had no idea. They hadn't really thought about it. I mean, they knew that the area was all white, and they knew that that's why it was a good school. And they just think that the blacks either didn't have the ambition or the money to move there because they didn't have as much income. But it wasn't true. So here's a case where we had to give people a deeper understanding, a deeper history, a truer history of how these things came into being. And because if they didn't understand them, they were never going to be able to work against it. I try to tell them, I said, look, the fight against racism, because a lot of them take it personally, I never did anything bad to blacks or my people. I just didn't own slaves. I said, look, if you think that white supremacy is just about, people saying nasty things about you, I said, all that's really trivial. What really matters are these structures that have to be taken down. And this is this is the heart and soul. And the thing that you have to understand or have to come to see is that these same structures hold you down. I mean, there's a classic example in the 50s, all these housing developments and so on got swimming pools for the kids. And when the kids wanted to come and swim in the pools too, they drained the pools rather than let the black kids in. So, did that punish the black kids? It certainly did. But the whites suffered from it as well. So that's why The white skin privilege is not in the class interest of any worker of any color. And that's a deep and profound lesson that we have to repeat over and over again. It's the secret to the rule as to why the bourgeoisie and capitalism remains in power. And we have to keep hammering away at it. It's not the only thing, but it's the most important thing.
Melanie has been putting some interesting things in the chat box. I don't know that everyone has been seeing them. Melanie, do you want to share the points that you put there?
I can put other stuff, but the main thing here is, if we look at the system, then the question of privilege is white privilege being something that should be expanded is actually not addressing the fact that the way things are organized are inhumane. And that many of the things that are white skin privileges, actually, I would argue, remove all of our humanity. And this just happened to be an interview between George Yancey, a very well-known philosopher, and Dave Roediger today in Truth Out. And so it just made that point. I can also put a PDF of the Breaking the Code, Everyday Forms of Whiteness, if anyone is interested, which speaks more to some of the original questions that you posed today. And I hope that, you know, if we're a little uncomfortable, I actually think that's where we need to be in this, and that, you know, liberation is not something to be assumed, and that we can stand with and learn and grow and contribute. And I hope that whatever discomfort that I've provoked is one that is actually exciting to think of new possibilities.
Well, we need to be wrapping up here. We've gone for 90 minutes. And if there are any closing words that anyone wants to share, speak now or hold your peace. Well, let me give thanks then to Carl and Melanie for an informative discussion. I certainly found it very interesting, and I want to also thank all those others who contributed to the discussion. Today's webinar, as well as past programs, are available on YouTube, accessible from our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. I hope that you will join us next Monday for our next webinar, which will feature Vijay Prashad talking about the continuity of US imperialism, a topic that certainly connects in very important ways with today's discussion as well. That's next Monday, May 31 at 1 o'clock Central Time or 2 o'clock Eastern Time. In closing, I want to thank our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, and yours truly. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday. And Roberto, if you leave this open for a few minutes so that those who want can copy the information that was put in the chat box.